And
Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor George. You pronounce your name, George.
George
Your last name.
Oesterdiekhoff.
All right, Oesterdiekhoff. Great. So, George, we're going to have a great conversation. You have written several books and articles detailing the rise of Western civilization and modernity. But before we get into the rise of the West, I would love to talk about your paper titled, "Why Did Pre-Modern Humans Ascribe Divinity to Their Ancestors and Parents?"
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And that's actually my first question. Why were pre-modern humans likely to assume that their parents or ancestors were godlike?
Mm-hmm.
That's my first question.
I have here some technical problems. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, why did pre-modern humans ascribe divine status to their parents and ancestors? Why did they worship their ancestors?
Yeah. Okay, understand. And children, by their 6th year, always regard their parents as some kind of magicians and as some kind of small or greater gods, because they cannot see the shortcomings parents have. Only when children go older and understand better the shortcomings of their parents, then they refrain from seeing them as magicians and as gods. And ancient humans, for the same reasons, adored their parents as gods when they are dead, but even before, because they can only adore their parents as gods, when the parents were still living, they had the same attitude to them. So I think developmental psychology can explain this behavior. Developmental psychology can explain ancestor worship and can trace it back to certain psychological origins. And that's the developmental explanation to that behavior and to that phenomenon.
All right. And I read your article, and in your article, you also implied that even in modern societies, children tend to view their parents as superhumans. Please explain the concept to our audience. Why is this so? Why do children, even in modern societies, perceive their parents to be superhumans?
No, I think that's easy to understand. Small children, aged 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, have not the ability to see that their parents cannot do everything. Instead, they believe, because they manage household, manage the life of the children, and manage their own lives, that they are able to do everything, that they master not only their house, their family, but that they master neighborhood and the whole small world children know. So it's inevitable that children must believe that parents have magical powers and that parents or adults at all have abilities that surmount those of children by far. And therefore, they cannot escape from seeing them as small or greater gods or as great magicians.
All right, George. And at what age do children begin to mature and engage in more analytical reasoning?
It was Pierre Bourdieu, the teacher of Jean Piaget, who wrote in 1951 a book. And he explained that children have this attitude by their 6th year. And when they are older, 7, 8 years, they start to surmount this belief. And because with 6 or 7 years, children go through their first skeptical crisis, through their first philosophical crisis. And then they start to understand that parents have many problems, that parents have difficulties, that parents have not superpower. But it's clear, when you are 2 years old, you have no idea that your parents can't do everything. And the same is true when you are aged 3 or 4 years. But with growing intelligence and with growing rationality, with 7, 8, or 9 years, you see it. And then you have not the ability anymore to see your parents as gods. Then you see them, or you tend to see them as normal persons, like we as grown-ups see human beings as people with problems and people with shortcomings and with people who do not master the world by magic or by anything else.
All right. And George, is this trait universal across cultures? Because in your article, you debunk other explanations that do not fall within your psychological developmental frame view, and you argue that ancestral worship is universal throughout all cultures. So just comment on this subject matter for our audience. Many of them may not be familiar with your work.
Yes, that's a very important point, because some ethnologists used to say, there are only some people with ancestor worship, and other pre-modern or archaic cultures do not have ancestor worship. But if you look in detail, then you see that the fear of the dead is a universal feature of all archaic cultures around the globe, on every continent, and at any time. You see this feature in Australian Aborigines. You see this feature common among the pre-Columbian cultures in America. You see this feature right across Europe, Russia, India, Japan, China, and Black Africa. It was once universal, and the first cultures who seem to have surmounted this feature were the Christian cultures and the Muslim cultures. Muslim religion and Christianity from birth onwards surmounted this belief and prevented people from adoring their parents, their dead parents. The Christianization in Europe started with the abolishment of ancestor worship and nature worship when the missionaries went through Europe to help people convert their religion. But it was once universal, and this universality is a phenomenon you can trace back to this developmental stage I described in the beginning of our talk. Because the pre-operational stage, the stage of the child, is a common basis. And because it is a common and universal basis, the phenomenon that originates in this stage was also universal, because pre-operational stage is universal, and therefore ancestor worship was also universal. And when people climb to higher stages, then they tend to abolish this phenomenon. So as Christian and Muslim religion surmounted this stage, this phenomenon, people left this earlier stage and climbed to higher stages. So the abolishment of ancestor worship is also a phenomenon that has to be traced back to a jump, a cognitive jump or psychological stage jump of mankind. And so we see nowadays in the world that this phenomenon vanished. Not everywhere at the same rate, but it declines, and it gets into a stage where it has only symbolic nature, but not the full psychology as it was in former times, when people talk to their dead parents as if they were alive. Now they communicated to them on a daily basis, gave them food and drink, and pray to them as if they would stay in the next room. And they believed that everything that happened to them was caused by them. Every lucky thing or every calamity was attributed to their magic. So the people living on Earth feared the dead people. They feared their dead parents because they believed they had supernatural power.
Yes, well, I like how you answered that question, because I was actually going to ask, is the decline of mysticism in Europe attributable to Christianity?
Yeah.
And you already answered that question. So I'm going to move on. George, in ancestral worship, were some ancestors more important than others? This is a point you enunciate in the article. You said that the recently deceased were more valued than the ancient ancestors.
Can you repeat?
Yeah, in your article, you noted that the recently deceased were more valuable than ancient ancestors. In other words, people are more likely to worship their parents and grandparents than great-great-grandparents. Yes.
Understand, yes.
I want you to talk about that.
The most important ancestors were the dead parents, great grandparents, and perhaps dead uncles and aunts, but not so much the ancestors 100, 200, 300 years ago. That was usually not in the age of worship. But there are some differences. I think China. In China, in some families or in some regions or in some periods of time, they did not only adore the dead parents and grandparents, but also ancestors who lived centuries ago. I know this from De Groot, the Dutch ethnologist 100 years ago, who described this in his great book, The Religion of the Chinese. And also Edward Tyler described this in his book, Primitive Culture, from 1871, that the Chinese were here an exception with this regard.
Yes?
Yes, a small difference. It's not a big difference. Okay, you know that China was especially famous for ancestor worship, perhaps more than any other culture in the world. But when you look in detail, and then you see that the ancestor worship of China may be a little bit special, but the commonalities are bigger than the differences with ancestor worship in China, ancient Greece, or Australians, or cultures in Africa. They all have very common features with this regard. They all give food and drink. They pray to the ancestors. They believe that the ancestors follow the life of the descendants, that they punish the descendants, or that they care for the good of the descendants, and so on.
All right. And this question is also quite pertinent. Did pre-modern humans view death as another stage of life? You right. Death does not separate, therefore, the living from the dead. They continue to live their common life and their communication. As children obey their parents, the grown-ups obey their dead ancestors. The dead ones are not really dead, but they have only changed the way they act. And although they are not visible, they're fully existent and present.
Yes, it is so. Usually, archaic people have no idea that death could be the true end of life. They all believe that in one way or other, you have an eternal life. And as that human, you was in your real life. Or if you have to go through a metamorphosis, in any way as a being that is real, that lives a real life. So they see the death as some kind of migration from one territory to another territory. But there they do the same thing. They hunt animals, they sleep in beds and so on. And children, by their 5th year or by their 6th year, in former time, developmental psychology said by their 8th or 9th year, have the same idea that the death is some kind of migration, but you do not perish. You do not vanish. You live a normal life after death.
Yes, and these practices are still evident in some societies in the contemporary world.
Yes, of course. Although I would say most peoples of the world still believe in afterlife, but I think they do not do it in this concrete way as the former humankind. They believe that the soul will exist, but not the body. Or they think that the day will come when the dead body will unify with the soul or so, but usually they think there is some mental power that will persist, but not the body and not the normal life. But in former times, people had a very concrete idea, a very detailed idea that you live in the afterworld the same way you did before you died.
George, is there a major difference between religion in the contemporary world or religion post-modernity and religion in these Asian societies?
Yes, yes. The religion was much stronger. The religiousness was much stronger. And people did much more for religion than nowadays. As for example, the Australians, they spent months of the year for their religious life, months of the year. Nowadays, people, they may go to church every day, or they may pray every day to their God, but they do not spend months of the year for religious ceremonies. So when you only take the time people spend for religious ceremonies, you see the difference. You see already the difference.
And George, in several of your articles, you refer to Jan de Groot. Why is he important?
I think this book on Chinese religion is wonderful. He has the ability to describe and to analyze in a very thorough manner. It's not so usual, not so common among social scientists and historians, but he has this ability. as far as I know, the University of Leiden has still a monument before the university building for him. And as far as I know, it is there for generations, because he must be dead, I think, for almost 100 years.
And this writer, did he write on rationality in Chinese religion? Because in one of your articles describing the rise of the West, you refer to Jan de Groot and how Chinese philosophy and doctrinal beliefs affected their development. De Groot had a very special look on China, because at that time, China was not a very well-developed country. And the people, the common people, adhered to many magical animistic views. And he described this very fine and very good. And I can estimate that nowadays, China's social scientists do not like this look de Groot had. But I don't know this because I don't know Chinese literature on de Groot. I did not follow this discussion, if there is any discussion. I think there will be some discussion, but I don't know this. Yes, but I'm really interested in the rise of the West and why China lagged behind, and it appears that de Groot is a relevant scholar for people interested in this type of research.
Ah, yeah. Okay, then you know this subject better than I. Yeah, okay. Yeah, because I share the opinion immediately, because all to describe some hindrances for China to institutionalize modern society. In fact, he did it. Because as he described China, or Chinese people, as some people behind the latest developments in the West, he willingly or not described that the culture of China is a hindrance to develop modern society. Yes, I understood this from his reading, but not as a consequence of his intention. Understand what I want to say?
Yes, and this is one of the reasons why I appreciate your work, because you give a different slant on the rise of the West, and it's a topic that will forever intrigue me and my audience.
Yeah. Because de Groot described China as more or less medieval society, as most societies of the world had been 150 years ago, more or less. And only Japan and North America and Europe started the industrial world in the 19th century, and the rest followed later on. And China was not under the latecomers and was not under the followers, as some other countries had been, like Russia or Japan also, but needed much longer time.
Yes, and George,
I think de Groot gives an answer to this.
And George, I have another important question to pose, and it may sound contentious to some of our viewers, but was pre-modern man a child? Was pre-modern man a kid, a child? That you have a book with that title?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you describe pre-modern man as having childlike tendencies.
You ask for the link between child developments and historical developments.
No. Yes? In a sense, I'm asking you to reflect on the personality of pre-modern men.
understand.
Yes, because you
There's
agree that there's a
knowledge.
lower stage of development, so that's what I'm asking you to discuss.
Yeah. Humans and the pre-modern world. They all had magical views, they all had animistic views, they all had some other traits that they shared with each other, no matter where they lived, whether they lived in medieval Europe or in 16th century Europe or in Africa or in both Americas or in Asia. They all shared some traits, and these traits are explainable in terms of developmental psychology, so that humans in advanced civilizations climbed higher stages and left these earlier stages, and therefore surmounted magical and animistic views and so on.
Yes, George. And again, many of our listeners must be wondering, why did these unique stages of development, so for example, humanism and the Enlightenment, first occurred in the West, what we now call rationality? Why was the West the pioneer in this regard?
That's difficult to answer, and I
Very
have
difficult.
Yes, and I have no complete answer to this. I don't know this exactly.
Yeah, but we have an article titled "The Rise of Modern Industrial Society: The Cognitive-Developmental Approach as the New Key to Solve the Most Fascinating Riddle in History." I would like you to comment briefly on it.
Yeah, it's only a description, but it's not a full explanation why it was this part of the world who started. Let's say so. One culture must go as first. As in human society, there must be one person who invented the aircraft. And it's more or less accidental who took the first step. Of course, it was not accidental. There exist some special causes, but I have no full awareness of that. I can only give some hints at that. For example, the invention of book printing by Gutenberg was important, or that the Greek philosophy was so much a forerunner in rationality and in philosophy and in sciences, and that the Europeans learned from the Greeks in the 15th and 16th century. And for example, the alphabet may be important. But of course, I have no complete answer to this. And the question is on the table: why did not Japan or why did not China were the first nations to start modern society and industrial revolution? To repeat it, I have no full answer to that.
Yeah, your page, the article I read that was published in Mankind Quarterly is 52 pages long. And in it, you often refer to the cognitive development approach as successor of the classical sociological theory. And although you know that the article is descriptive, I find it to be quite insightful. Because
yeah, I understand what you want to say. But when I say that the cognitive developmental approach gives an answer to this, this is only an explanation that needs another explanation I do not give. Now, of course, it was a cognitive revolution. Of course, it was the developmental process. that initiated this revolution in culture and society, of course. This is an explanation, this is an answer, but this explanation and this answer has to be referred to other explanations. Why started the cognitive revolution in Europe and why not in Asia? Understand? Now, an explanation can be a description with reference to other questions. And when I say the psychological stage development or the cognitive revolution is the explanation for the rise of the West, then this answer, this explanation is also only a description with reference to the question, why did the cognitive revolution started in the West? And for this, I do not have a full answer. I can only say the specifics of the alphabet. Now, the Phoenician or Latin alphabet or alphabet has some advantages to the scripture of the Chinese or the Japanese. And the role of Aristotelian philosophy may be crucial. And the book printing of Gutenberg, because the book printing of Gutenberg is better than the Chinese printing of books, because it has individuals stamps.
Yes, in George, one writer argues that usually industrial development would peter out because countries lack an epistemic base, and the Europe developed this epistemic base. In other words, knowledge is cumulative, and Europeans were able to build on the work of their intellectual forefathers, whereas in other cultures, revolutions petered out, and when revolutions did in fact occur, they were often invoked to justify existing ideologies. But Europe had a stronger epistemic base. This is one argument posited by an economist, Joel Mokyr.
Yeah, Joel Mokyr, yeah.
Yes,
very,
yes.
Very good author. Yeah.
Yes,
the level of
brilliant.
Riches. Yeah, the level of riches. Yeah.
Yeah, man. Joel Mokyr is very brilliant. And what I like about him is that he's also balanced. So on the one hand, he's pointing out the accolades of Western society, but he also notes that China had a proto-enlightenment movement, and he gave reasons to explain why it did not succeed.
That's fine. Yeah, that's right. The accumulation of knowledge is very important, but I would not say that the West was better in accumulation of knowledge.
No, not better, but better at system, but better at the synthesis of it.
Yeah, okay. Because if somebody would say the rise of modern society is the work of all people of the world, I would agree. Because the accumulation of knowledge was not blocked in certain cultures, because there was a dissemination of knowledge right across the world, and this for many thousand years. So that the technologies the Japanese or the Chinese invented, inventions that found their way to the West and helped the West to build up modern society, that is crucial. And the other way around, of course, too. Now, this accumulation of knowledge is a worldview, and so the whole humankind built up modern society. It's possible to say and to argue so, but this accumulation of knowledge does not suffice to explain the rise of the West or to explain the rise of modern industrial society, because we have here a cultural evolution taken place in 17th and 18th and 19th century. And this cultural revolution is not something that directly depends from the mere accumulation of knowledge, because here we have the cognitive revolution, the rise of the adolescent stage of formal operations. And so the technologies the Europeans invented in 18th and 19th century were not simply a result of the worldwide accumulation of knowledge. This was something new, because these technologies could only be invented by the adolescent stage of formal operations, that is, the rise of the physical sciences, born in formal operations, born in Europe during the 17th and 18th century. And that is something new. That is not a simple result of the worldwide accumulation of knowledge taking place for thousands of years.
Yes, and the Europeans commercialize knowledge. So for example, by the Industrial Revolution, many of China's inventions had fallen into disuse, whereas the Europeans consistently improved on old European technologies and foreign technologies. This has not been the norm historically.
Yeah, I agree, yeah.
And what is also important is the revolution in painting. And in one of your articles, you discuss this revolution in painting. And let me read a snippet. Some historians of art, especially before 1940, but also in recent times, have described similarities between children's drawings and the pre-Renaissance painting in its worldwide dimensions. Pre-operational spatial understanding is the cause of these common features. I am just vaguely familiar with Renaissance art. I'm more interested in the philosophy of art. So for example, Noel Carroll has a book on the philosophy of art, and I've perused it, but I'm not an expert in the different styles of art.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. It was Susie Gablick, an author who died some years ago in North America, but she studied and worked in London for many years. And she wrote in 1976 a book, Progress in Art. And she was probably the first to write a book about the link between Piagetian stages on the one hand and art history on the other hand. And she showed that the painting, the pre-Renaissance painting and also the Asian painting was shaped by certain structures typical for the stage of intellectual realism. And intellectual realism is a kind of painting and drawing of children by their 9th year. So the characteristics are the following. First, it's a two-dimensional painting without perspective. Second, the distances and the sizes of the objects painted on the flat are not measured. They are just so. Third, the painters paint what they know from an object and not what is seeable from a certain viewpoint. And that is typical for children by their 9th year in modern society or everywhere. And it's typical for ancient painters even then, when they were famous, and even then, when they have nothing done in their life as painting from their childhood on. And the reason to that must be, so Susie Gablick writes, and I agree with that, that's the medieval and ancient painters did not reach the stage of concrete operational stage, but remained staying on the pre-operational stage with these spatial characteristics I described. And the Renaissance painting developed the central perspective, the three-dimensional painting, and they developed the method to paint only these things a certain person can see from a certain viewpoint and nothing else. That is, to us, self-evident and the state of the art for centuries. But in former times, nobody did this. Even not in Asia, and even not in Asia of the 16th or 17th centuries, and even not in the paintings of the ancient Egyptians, who also shared this stage of intellectual realism. And the stage the children develop after the 9th year is called visual realism. And Susie Gablick and others say that painters of the Renaissance and the post-Renaissance period developed this stage of visual realism too. And that is, they developed the concrete operational stage, and that is the concrete operational spatial understandings.
Brilliant analysis.
That's amazing. That's
yes.
Very interesting, and it's not so easy to explain. I will tell you why. These painters in ancient times visited schools and were trained by famous teachers with long experience and so on. And the question arises, why these painters, when they started with their work early in their life, perhaps in boyhood, why could they not master these skills? When we say that usually certain stages cannot be reached because developmental windows are closed in early childhood. But these people started to paint, we can assume, or we can be taught by historians of art with this regard. They started to paint early in boyhood, but could not master these techniques and could not learn them. And the only answer to this amazing and astonishing question is that the ancient and medieval culture generally had not the power to raise a concrete operational stage in the minds of the people, so that specific abilities could not be gained because of that general blockade, because of that general hindrance. And this is something absolutely amazing and absolutely astonishing that makes me crazy a little bit.
But George, when are you going to write on the quantitative revolution in the West? Because the West, in a sense, created the quantitative revolution. The IQ test was invented in the West. Statistics, this is also a Western invention. Westerners pioneered the art of measurements. Yes, earlier societies in Egypt and even the Aztecs had various tools to measure variables, but Westerners are the true pioneer. Alfred Crosby has a book on the topic. It's a short book, but few scholars seem to be interested in unlocking the Western origins of the quantitative revolution.
It's interesting. It's amazing. It's really astonishing.
Yeah, and it's a complicated task.
Yeah, absolutely. I cannot answer to all these questions. I have written about these subjects 13 books by now, and about 60 or 70 journal articles, mostly in peer review journals, and some dozens more articles. And I occupy with this subject for almost 40 years now. But I have no answer to all these questions, and many questions are open to further research, and there are many books that have to be written about this subject, because we have by now not a good book about the evolution of morals. We have not a good book about the evolution of politics. There is not a great book about the political developments understandable in terms of developmental stages. We have not this book. And so many books are missing that have to be written about the subject. That is a terrible situation. When I want to collect all monographs that are written about the link between developmental stages in history, we do not come to 20 or 25 books about it. And think about how many books are written about Plato's philosophy, thousands, I estimate. And it's crazy. And it shows us that sciences are not good, are not well developed. Our social sciences are not well developed.
George, I don't really agree with you. I think the issue is that social scientists today have access to better data, but they're just cowards. That's the issue. So for example, Norbert Elias, we don't have people writing in this vein today.
Yeah, okay, I agree with you.
I think that's the issue. So for example, are you going, well, you still do research, but I'm in my 20s and obviously you're an older person. How many scholars or podcasters or young writers are really interested in this type of research? How many young people want to talk to George about the cognitive development of approach as an explanation for the rise of the West? Not many.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a philosophy of cultural relativism that has destroyed much. People do not want to hear it because they think people are insulted or blamed for some deficits, but that's not the point, because developmental psychology shows that all humans started with the same stages, and that all humans are equal in it to stay on certain stages, and they all go through the same development, but some do it earlier than others. That's the whole story. And therefore, I see this theory as basis for humanity, and I see this theory as a basis for a common understanding of humans on Earth. And I see this theory as the only rebuttal and refutation of racial theories, because racial biological theories have other viewpoints. And this theory here shows that every culture can develop modernity and modern society, and all people of all cultures can develop the adolescent stage of formal operations. And when they did it, not sufficiently by now, then this has factors to find in culture and socialization. And there are only forerunners and backbenchers, that's all. But that there are forerunners and backbenchers, that is also clear when you do not rely on developmental psychology. You can also count the number of cars or the income, or you can count wealth and economics. Then you have always forerunners and backbenchers. And now you have also forerunners and backbenchers with regard to cognitive development. But that's all. And that should not be a problem for anybody to blockade the development of social sciences and to blockade the development of humanities.
Yes, and George, what is also quite revealing about your work is that it is multifaceted. So for example, you even have a paragraph on music. Many people may not be aware of this point, but Western music is also unique, as you write. To my knowledge, the history of music is not written in terms of psychological stages by now. Thus, there is some difference to the history of painting and literature concerning scientific endeavors related. George, what is so special about Western music, especially during the period 1700 to 1900 in Europe?
Yeah, there are some authors who wrote at least a little bit about it. So people who I studied and write, but I'm not an expert in music and in history of music, but I think that some historians of music will have provided research that comes close to these insights. I think you only have to combine a stage theory to researchers some historians of music have already done, and you will find a very quick solution. So let's stay on the surface of the phenomena, and then you see that the so-called classic music, invented by Bach and Beethoven and so on, this is something very special, and that is the reason why it is played in houses all over the world, and that the best musicians try to learn to play this music. And it is special, and this unique character falls into the same time span when modern society started its rise. Now it started in the 17th century and well developed into the 18th and 19th century. And this is 3 centuries where you find the great composers of classic music. Now, these 3 centuries. And these 3 centuries are the centuries of enlightenment, of modernization, of industrialization in Europe. And this cannot be an accidental connection. There must stay behind this link a certain structure. And I call this certain structure psychological development. There must be behind this link and behind the rise of this classic music a certain psychological stage development that causes this development of music and arts.
Brilliant again, and I must share this point with our audience. The great revolution in the entire music history of the world came with the 12-step tone system around 1700. Yeah. So our readers can go and do their research and read their paper, and their paper is titled The European Miracle, Psychological Stages and the Origin of Modern Society. So far, George, we have been collating the relevant information, and this is quite useful work because many tend to be shying away from this type of research. So the next step is to provide serious explanations. And because life expectancy is on the increase, maybe within the next 20 or 30 years, you will have an answer.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, because George, you don't plan to stop writing anytime soon.
Please?
Do you plan to stop writing?
No.
Exactly.
I'm just writing a 550 pages book on the subject, and and I was good in the last time with publishing in some journals like Anthropos and the American Journal of Psychology. An article about the development of logic in American Journal of Psychology will be published in the next year.
All right.
And in this year, the journal published an article about developmental windows and developmental ages of humans in history. And journal articles are good, but books are also good because books gives the possibility to write greater context.
All right. Now, George, we're going to discuss your most controversial paper, The Cognitive-Developmental Approach as Contribution to the Explanation of the Arabian Migrants' Criminality. You don't need to discuss the paper all, you don't need to discuss all of the paper, but I think your point is quite clear. The argument is that these men are at a lower stage of psychological development, and this is one explanation as to why they would molest women. So just comment on it briefly, and then I will give some extra points.
Oh, yeah, the Harvard psychologist, Steven Pinker, in his bestseller published 10 years ago, The Better Angels of Our Nature, described that violence declined in history, and that violence declined especially in more advanced nations, and that nations which are not belonging to the forerunners manifest greater rates of violence. And of course, you see it. The sociologist Norbert Elias described that medieval people in Europe were much more cruel and were much more violent than modern people living in Europe. And of course, you see this phenomenon also in other nations. So humankind went through the same stages also concerning violence.
Yes. And George, you said that the Arabian men, they harassed the women because they were at a lower stage of psychological development, and I agree with you. Furthermore, it is often the norm in Germany and in England for the media and their allies to cover up atrocities committed by migrants from Muslim countries.
You see the
For example, there's the Rotterdam scandal, and there are other examples in Germany.
You see the Christmas Eve in 2015, where the police and the officials first started to cover up the situation, and then via internet, the things became public, and then we had more than 1,000 accusations against some people who molested these girls, and then we had the discussion, where does it come from? And then some people said it comes from their education, it comes from their view on women. But you must take this phenomenon in a broader context, and you must see that earlier people tended to be more violent than modern civilized people. Pinker, in his book of 2010, wrote that pre-state nations, some thousand years ago, there were 500 homicides per year per 100,000 people, and this declined to one person killed per year per 100,000 people in the most advanced nations of today. That is a ratio from 1 to 500. And of course, this has something to do with psychogenetic development, as Norbert Elias, in his theory of civilization, described many years ago, many decades ago, and Pinker 10 years ago, in his bestseller.
Modern people exhibit higher levels of self-control. So, for example, in Jamaica, some attribute sexual harassment to patriarchy or other bogus positions, but the IQ of Jamaica is 75.08, and this is basically the level of mental instability if you're an adult. IQ below 70 is virtually retarded. So countries with IQ in this range will have problems. Men are not necessarily harassing women because of patriarchy. Many of these men are impulsive and they're unable to delay gratification. I think these are the more crucial issues.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, they're very good.
Yeah. It is not because of the patriarchy or the fact that some men want to oppress women. No, mature people are less likely to harass people. Intelligent people have the ability to temper hostile situations. So sexual harassment, like crime more broadly, is a consequence of lower IQ and lower levels of cognitive development.
That's
Yeah.
a good idea.
Yeah.
It is confirmed by many authors and researchers, especially by the good book of Pinker.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but George, we had an excellent conversation, but I'm wrapping up now, so we'll talk again, and I will continue to read your articles. All right, bye.
Okay. Thank you
George.
very much for your very fine questions and for your good understanding of the things, and also many thanks to your good hints at phenomena I didn't know before. Thank you very much.
All right, bye.
Bye.